Hello everyone. Today we are going to talk about Tocqueville. He was born at a time when democracy had established itself in Europe and in America. Or that was at least the perception. But for an insightful mind such that Tocqueville possessed, it seemed a bit odd that even though the French have gone through the remarkable revolution of 1789, and in the same year, the Constitution of the United States has also been ratified in the New World. Nonetheless, the two countries seem to be adopting the democratic political system in a different manner. Tocqueville was in search for, amongst many other things, the reasons for the difference in the development and implementation of democratic principles in the newly founded state across the Atlantic, and his beloved France. So, to know these differences, he decided to go to New England, as the United States was called at the time, and witness himself the causes of these differences. Where did the difference lie? In the historical development, in the political institutions, in the culture of adoption, or in all of them? He wrote his reflections in his magnum opus, running for 4 volumes, that came to be known as Democracy in America. Today we are going to look just at the introduction of this book, which seems to be the last section he wrote. In it he condenses his main reflections. But before we look at his main ideas, we need to ask Tocqueville that how is it possible that a Frenchman who has spent most of his life in France would know more about America, no matter how well read and well acquainted he may be with the literature of the foreign country? How can he dare to know about America than the Americans as a stranger? Here is the first justification of this stranger that authenticates his judgment in the book. He says, quote open, "A stranger frequently hears important truths at the fireside of his host, which the latter would perhaps conceal from the ear of friendship. He consoles himself with his guest for the silence to which he is restricted, and the shortness of the traveller's stay takes away all fear of his indiscretion." Quote close. He not only read the American legal system, he also met prominent American thinkers and politicians, and he reports that he noted down immediately whatever he heard and saw in the States. And given the tendency of human nature to be more discreet to one's friend and more open to a trustworthy stranger, he took complete advantage of his status as a stranger to milk as much knowledge as he could from the inhabitants of New England. As would become clearer later that one of his primary objectives of his research was a difference in the historical development of democracy in the States and in Europe. The history of political progress was different on the two continents. But it still remains to be asked, why after all America? Why did he choose this nation as his object of study? Well, here we go. This is what he has to say. Quote open. "I have selected the nation from amongst those which have undergone it, in which its development has been the most peaceful and the most complete, in order to discern its natural consequences, and if it be possible, to distinguish the means by which it may be rendered profitable. I confess that in America I saw more than America. I sought the image of democracy itself, with its inclinations, its character, its prejudices, and its passions, in order to learn what we have to fear or to hope from its progress." Quote close. In America, he saw more than America. He saw democracy institutionalized in its culture, its institutions, its legal system, etc. But as he clarifies, he is not just interested to write a textbook of American political and legal system. That is not his objective. His motivation is to learn what the Europeans, and particularly the French, must fear or hope from its progress. He is interested in America because there he could discern the effects of democracy more clearly than in the ruckus of Paris. where confusion still reigned, and we retrospectively can also see that democracy in France had to go through 5 revisional phases, and now finally we have the fifth republic there. But in America, we still have the first republic. Okay, understood. But where should we begin with the analysis? Can we find any fundamental principle, something that became the base on which the whole architecture of American political system is erected? Yes, Tocqueville, any suggestions? Right at the beginning of his introduction, he provides the answer to this fundamental question. He asserts, quote open, the more I advanced in the study of American society, the more I perceived that the equality of conditions is the fundamental fact from which all others seem to be derived, and the central point at which all my observations constantly terminated. Quote close. Equality of conditions. That's the answer. Let me say, equality of conditions is the fundamental political principle that we call democracy in America, according to Tocqueville. But how do we understand this terminating point? Does not equality of conditions seem a bit vague concept to begin with? We have heard of equality of opportunities in our times. Is equality of conditions the same thing? It is not a simple answer for Tocqueville to give. He has to give some historical background to explain not just this principle, but also the historical development that took place leading America to reach this terminating point. He begins with the discussion of nobility. In the 11th century, nobility was inaccessible to a commoner. But then something changed in the course of the following 2 centuries, and he explains it thus. Quote open. The value attached to the privileges of birth decreased in the exact proportion in which new paths were struck out to advancement. In the 11th century, nobility was beyond all price. In the 13th, it might be purchased. It was conferred for the first time in 1270, and equality was thus introduced into the government by the aristocracy itself. Quote close. The status of nobility was secured for the elite class. They never thought they would have to share their governing power with a petty commoner in the 11th century. But gradually, the aristocracy itself introduced a flicker of hope through the conferment of nobility to the public. It was the first seed of democratic spirit. Demos in Greek means the public. So the more the people involved in the decision-making process of the government, the more democratic the political system is in theory. Therefore, the gradual trend of sharing the government with the public began in the 13th century. That is good news, ain't it, Tocqueville? Finally, democracy emerging again after the ancient times on the historical stage. He would be skeptical of being too optimistic about the intentions of the ruling class. As he clarifies, quote open, in the course of these 700 years, it sometimes happened that in order to resist the authority of the crown or to diminish the power of their rivals, the nobles granted a certain share of political rights to the people. Or more frequently, the king permitted the lower orders to enjoy a degree of power with the intention of repressing the aristocracy. In France, the kings have always been the most active and the most constant of levelers. When they were strong and ambitious, they spared no pains to raise the people to the level of the nobles. When they were temperate or weak, they allowed the people to rise above themselves. Quote close. It means that the main objective of giving power to the commoner was not to actually increase the size of the pie, but to use the public, who were inexperienced in the matters of governance, as pawns in the power struggle between the crown and the aristocracy. Florence of Renaissance Italy is one of the few examples of how the aristocracy and the king were always bustling with each other, at times siding with the public, appeasing them, and then creating the councils and other constitutions to strike a balance between the power of the aristocrats and the demands of the public. Tocqueville further gives an example of French history to make his point. If we examine what has happened in France at intervals of 50 years, beginning with the 11th century, we shall invariably perceive that a twofold revolution has taken place in the state of society. The noble has gone down on the social ladder, and the roturier has gone up. The one descends as the other rises. Every half century brings them nearer to each other, and they will very shortly meet. Quote close. The perfect balance is the scenario when the gap between the public and the aristocracy will be such that a person looking at an aristocrat will not be able to distinguish any status marker separating him from a common man. When an outside observer would look at an aristocrat, he would take him as a commoner, and when he would look at a commoner, he would take him as an aristocrat. But that is the ideal balance. It had not yet been achieved in Tocqueville's time, but he could see this state of affairs in far future. But again, we do not yet get out of the power struggle, and it is important to know how could the public break these barriers to stop being a pawn and actually start to govern. All would not have been so dark, Tocqueville. Does not democracy in other domains, apart from politics, provide a glimpse of hope? Fortunately, it does. He mentions literature as the weapon of the poor. As we know, the two towering French figures of the Enlightenment, Voltaire and Rousseau, had done their bit with pen. Most probably them and maybe Montesquieu are in his mind when he says the following. Quote open. From the time when the exercise of the intellect became the source of strength and of wealth, it is impossible not to consider every addition to science, every fresh truth, and every new idea as a germ of power placed within the reach of the people. Poetry, eloquence, and memory, the grace of wit, the glow of imagination, the depth of thought, and all the gifts which are bestowed by Providence with an equal hand, turn to the advantage of the democracy. And even when they were in the possession of its adversaries, they still served its cause by throwing into relief the natural greatness of man. Its conquests spread, therefore, with those of civilization and knowledge, and literature became an arsenal where the poorest and the weakest could always find weapons to their hand. Quote close. All of a sudden, it seems that democracy is a good thing. Tocqueville has a different style of writing. He does not list down advantages and disadvantages in two columns. That this is what you get if you have democracy and this is what you get if you do not have democracy. No. Political developments throughout history are organic for each country. Nothing happens in a vacuum. A political society as a whole deals with the problems it faces. Nothing is predictable or pre-planned in history or politics. Everything happens and just happens all at once, with different factors coming together, merging into a new system as new means of communication and knowledge develop, promoting ideas and passions amongst the public and the ruling class alike. Nobody ever gets to know precisely what advantage a society would accumulate with a particular political system. This is perhaps the reason that Tocqueville's writing style is conversational, mentioning different dimensions of societal forces working together without focusing too much on a chronological style for the large part of his introduction. Since now the listener or the reader would be a bit confused, like what is he actually suggesting? So are you saying, Tocqueville, that this democratic spirit is short-lived? Will the rule of the mob overtake the rule of the one, or we would go back to kingship? What's in store for us? On this question, he harks back to the divine plan and states with confidence, quote open, "It is not necessary that God himself should speak in order to disclose to us the unquestionable signs of his will. We can discern them in the habitual course of nature and in the invariable tendency of events. I know, without a special revelation that the planets move in the orbits traced by the Creator's finger? If the men of our time were led by attentive observation and by sincere reflection to acknowledge that the gradual and progressive development of social equality is at once the past and future of their history, this solitary truth would confer the sacred character of a divine decree upon the change. To attempt to check democracy would be in that case to resist the will of God, and the nations would then be constrained to make the best of the social lot awarded to them by Providence. Quote close. So basically, we do not need to worry that power would ultimately trickle down in everyone's hands. That is the divine plan according to him. Democracy is not a man made principle, it is a divine principle because, in the eyes of God, everyone is equal. Nobody has privilege over the other as far as being a creature of God is concerned. That would mean, Tocqueville, that man is actually following the divine will. Then why is there so much skepticism on your part regarding this democratic project? He has some reservations because there is equality of conditions, but it is not equality of all conditions. That is the main problem. Democracy in America has skewed its focus on the betterment of its material conditions and left behind, most importantly, the moral condition. He claims, quote open, the consequence of this has been that the democratic revolution has been affected only in the material parts of society, without that concomitant change in laws, ideas, customs, and manners which was necessary to render such a revolution beneficial. We have gotten a democracy, but without the conditions which lessen its vices and render its natural advantages more prominent. And although we already perceive the evils it brings, we are ignorant of the benefits it may confer. Quote close. So now we see Tocqueville taking his turn underscoring the problems with democracy in America. But he does not give a static snapshot of this political system, because we should remember that he wanted to give a dynamic analysis such that he could understand the future effects of democratic republic and alert the French and the Europeans that this is what is coming ahead for you. So we have only this problem of material prosperity at the cost of moral development that disturbs you, huh, Tocqueville? He would just lean back a bit in his armchair and with a swift remark at quote open, men are not corrupted by the exercise of power or debased by the habit of obedience, but by the exercise of a power which they believe to be illegal and by obedience to a rule which they consider to be usurped and oppressive. But here it may be asked, what we have adopted in the place of those institutions, those ideas, and those customs of our forefathers which we have abandoned. The spell of royalty is broken, but it has not been succeeded by the majesty of the laws. The people has learned to despise all authority, but fear now extorts a larger tribute of obedience than that which was formerly paid by reverence and by love. Quote close. Now the reverence of kingdom is replaced by the fear of mob. He highlights that in democracy, whoever does not win considers the governing power to have usurped their right to rule. But it is not just envy that ails democracy. If we turn our eyes towards the corruption index in the world, we find many democracies, and let's say an illusory tapestry of democracy, in which usurpation of power is easy through corruption. He further elaborates on this issue in partisan terms. Quote open. In the heat of the struggle, each partisan is hurried beyond the limits of his opinions by the opinions and the excesses of his opponents, until he loses sight of the end of his exertions and holds a language which disguises his real sentiments or secret instincts. Hence arises the strange confusion which we are witnessing. I cannot recall to my mind a passage in history more worthy of sorrow and of pity than the scenes which are happening under our eyes. It is as if The natural bond which unites the opinions of man to his tastes and his actions to his principles was now broken. The sympathy which has always been acknowledged between the feelings and the ideas of mankind appears to be dissolved, and all the laws of moral analogy to be abolished. Quote close. America today sounds exactly the same as America of the 19th century, and not just the States. Looking at the recent news of how le Nouveau Front Populaire is reacting to the nomination of the new Prime Minister Barnier, we find these issues surfacing again and again in democracy. Now, there does not seem to be a visionary party, but everything that a party represents is defined by its contradiction to the party opposite. Tocqueville could envisage this strange partisanship emerging in partisan politics, where pulling others down is the main target and not moving up together. After having addressed these issues in the introduction, at the end he finishes it with a picture of where democracy stood in the 19th century. He concludes, quote open, "Where are we then? The religionists are the enemies of liberty, and the friends of liberty attack religion. The high-minded and the noble advocate subjection, and the meanest and most servile minds preach independence. Honest and enlightened citizens are opposed to all progress, whilst men without patriotism and without principle are the apostles of civilization and of intelligence. Has such been the fate of the centuries which have preceded our own? And has man always inhabited a world like the present, where nothing is linked together, where virtue is without genius, and genius without honor? Where the love of order is confounded with the state for oppression, and the holy rights of freedom with the contempt of law, where the light thrown by conscience on human actions is dim, and where nothing seems to be any longer forbidden or allowed, honorable or shameful, false or true." Quote close. Where are we then in the 21st century? I leave you with this thought. Thank you, everyone.